If anybody had the opportunity to be selling fed cattle this week, you ought to be happy. What did they sell fed cattle for yesterday? 150, 152. Huge numbers. Those people that were willing to take a little bit of risk and do their homework, like Dan was talking about last fall when some of us were thinking doom and gloom, are cutting a fat hog right now, coming out of the feed yard. So the opportunities are still there. It's just the cost of doing business is a lot higher. But where the concept of marketing excess forage came up was from Hugh and the planning group that, you know, across this region, whether it's here, further west, or whatever, we've had a lot of cattle leave the country. And so hopefully as we try to recover out of a drought, there's going to be excess forage because we've destocked, cows have left the country, and so whatever you've got left in terms of cattle may not be what your carrying capacity could be if the rains return and we start producing forage, so you'll have, quote, excess forage on hand. How might we take advantage of that? And so, you know, the first one that we're all aware of is we face annual climatic variation. And that's not only how much rain we have during the year, but when that rain occurs. And the other one that I'll mention something about climate outlook here in just a minute is what I call effective precipitation. You know, our outlook for climate is that over the next several years, we're going to be warmer than we have been the past 30 years. How does temperature affect how well that precipitation works? You know, if it's warmer when it's raining, we probably have less effective precipitation. And so really effective precipitation, what is the temperature when it's occurring and what time of year become important. And those are really what we've got to deal with in this idea of excess forage. And I really think that's why as we move forward trying to make some decisions of what we do, this is a big one we need to talk about. And what we need to do is build some flexibility in. And some people are good at building flexibility in. Other people did not build flexibility in. And you can see that in some of the people on how they came out of this drought or how they're moving through the dry period we're having now is what kind of flexibility they had. And that flexibility in our operations is the ability to respond to changes in climate that I'm specifically talking about. And we need to figure out how to minimize the impacts on our core assets and our operation. And since we're in a cow-calf conference, we're talking about cow-calf, you know, our core assets are, number one, our range and pasture resources that we have. A lot of these areas need some time to recover after what we've been through. That's what we paid the big dollars for, is to buy the ranch. We need to protect that resource. And the second thing we've got in there is our cows. Those are a big investment, becoming bigger every day. How do we protect that core asset in our cows? I'll pick on my friends down in South Texas. You know, we can get into what I call the South Texas mentality is it doesn't rain, so we sell our cows. It rains next week, and we go buy the cows back for $500 more than we sold them for before. And then it doesn't rain the next 2 weeks, and we sell them for $500 less than what we bought them for 2 weeks before. That's not the kind of management you want to get into. We want to protect that base production asset out on the ranch and then also protect those financial resources that we have. And that's where the flexibility, trying to set a base plan up where we can adjust and weather through some of this climatic variation comes into play, but also be able to take advantage of those times when it does rain or it rains at the right time and we have, quote, excess forage production that we can utilize. Thinking about 2014, we hopefully are moving out of this historic drought. Notice I've got a question mark up there, because out where I live, I don't believe we're moving out of it yet. We're in Ron mentioned Oklahoma. Just go west a little ways if you feel bad, okay, and look out there. But are we moving out of this historic drought or not? If we are, what strategies we'd use as we move forward? The other thing, of course, we've all heard it, we've got low cattle inventories nationally. We've got high values on our cattle, high prices, very good returns if I'm in the cow-calf business. Even though the cost of doing business is higher, very good promise for good returns. But as I mentioned earlier, the cost of getting back into the business have gone up. And so as we think about that with climatic variation, the cost of getting back into the cow business, what kind of risk is that fixing to expose me to if I go out and I have to invest, you name the number, $1,800, $2,000, $2,200, whatever, to put cows back out there, but I'm still facing this potential issue in front of me of climatic variation. And how do I protect that financial resource, or do I take advantage of some of these opportunities that Dan mentioned earlier? And on the intermediate to long-term climate outlook, I know people don't like to talk about weathermen. They say they can't predict if it's going to rain next week or not. But if you look at a lot of the long-term climate outlook, and I'm talking about 10, 15-year outlooks, we're in a cycle climatically, whether it's man-made or the way God created the earth. We're in a climate cycle where we are going to be more variable and over the long term, on average, drier and warmer than we have been in the past 20 or 30 years. So that says that moving out in front of us, even if we're moving out of this, quote, drought, we still have some climate risk out in front of us that some of us may not have experienced. Now, some of y'all were around in the 50s, okay? I was born on the back end of the 1950s drought, so I don't have any memory of it. My memories are growing up in New Mexico, and it was so wet out there you had to pull the school bus out of the bar ditch occasionally because they couldn't get down the road. It's not that way anymore. So we all have different frames of reference, but right now it does look like we may have more exposure to climatic risk as we move forward. And so you put those two together, the cost of getting back in the business or restocking with cows and the potential for more climate risk out in front of us, it presents a situation you really got to think hard about in terms of how do I restock or how do I use that excess forage. So again, the high investment to reenter, a cautious climate outlook, what are the risks, and then what are the strategies we develop to try working around that risk, but yet take advantage of opportunities. So the big decision comes if you're a cow-calf producer, what kind of cow numbers do I decide to run relative to what my long-term average carrying capacity is? And notice I said long-term average carrying capacity. So that's what a lot of people think about. Well, out in my part of the world, this is 35 or 40 acre country, so I'm going to run a cow to 35 or 40 acres. That would be what I call long-term average carrying capacity. But is that really where I want to be with my cow operation? Because as these move closer together, what I actually put out there in terms of cow numbers versus what my long-term average carrying capacity would be over the long term, as I move those closer and closer together, I have less flexibility. And a lot of that lowered flexibility is from the standpoint that if I've invested a lot of money in cows, it makes it more difficult sometimes psychologically to make decisions to adjust. And it may make it a lot more painful to adjust. So what we need to do is keep some spread between what our actual cow numbers are and what that theoretical long-term average carrying capacity is, and create some flexibility or a buffer in our operations. Now this is Amarillo, Texas. Average rainfall. Again, this isn't Ardmore, but I'm sure we could build a graph that looks about like this. Starting back in 1892, going up to last year, and this is just annual rainfall expressed as a percentage of the average over the long term. So the red line is, that would be average rainfall. And over time, you can see there's several years in here where we had very nice rainfall, but there's more years, if you look at those points, where we're below that average number. And so my decision is, do I want to take, like out in that country again, 30-acre cow country, do I want to stock at 30 acres because that's what the long term is, or do I want to build myself some flexibility and some insurance and stock somewhere lower than that? And that's where we talk about using excess forage. So again, the age-old recommendation that still has value is set your carrying capacity for your cows at a level that can be sustained during periods of low precipitation. And during times of plenty, utilize and market the excess forage production with what I call temporary stock. They're not permanent residents. They can leave if we need them to leave. and the cost of them leaving is not going to be as dramatic as the cost of that investment in that cow herd might be if I were to have to sell them. So again, if we take the Amarillo data just as an example, if I wanted to be extremely conservative, I would come down here and say, you know, I really ought to stock cows at about 65 or 70% of what my, quote, long-term carrying capacity is. And then that way, when we have these fluctuations in rainfall, unless they're extremely severe, like they were 2012, 2013 out in our area, I'm going to be pretty safe maintaining my core asset in my cow herd, keeping that production unit in place. Also, I'm stocked at a level that I should have appropriate use of my rangeland resources and not do a great deal of harm to them. If I make the decision to stock up here at the 100% line, I am exposing myself to quite a bit of risk over time due to climate. So the question becomes, if I stock at 65 or 70%, and we have a year like this when they were coming out of the drought of the 50s, what do I do with all that excess forage? And that's the intent, to throw some ideas out for you based on that. So determine your base cow numbers, and you can set it wherever you want to, however conservative you want to be. Set my base cow numbers, and then there's one or two ways to set up how to determine or how to set a strategy to use your excess forage. One of those might be this. I've set my base cow numbers. I'm going to assume that every year I'm going to have average rainfall, okay? And then I'm going to use those flexible stock numbers and stock up every year to what my theoretical average carrying capacity would be. But then as time goes through, I may have to make on-the-fly adjustments as I monitor, because I've already stocked up as if I'm going to have average rainfall. But if I don't have average rainfall, I've got to be willing to, on the fly, make adjustments during that production year. Or the other approach is to monitor your forage conditions and add stock to utilize carryover forage. So in this part of Oklahoma, what time of year have you probably had most of your forage production already occur? August or September? Usually by August or September, your forage production's done on your warm season forages. You may get a little bit of fall growth, but you can have a good idea. So in this second option would be, I'm going to go out in August, September, maybe October. I'm going to evaluate what my forage production has been during that growing season. And if I have excess forage production, then I'll make some plans on how to use that carryover forage. So it's a little bit different approach than I'm just going to assume I have average rainfall, stock up, and make adjustments, or I'm going to let the forage grow, then I'm going to make adjustments to utilize the carryover. And so, you know, there's a little bit of different risk involved in those decisions. So an example of this might be, under average conditions, I have a ranch that'll produce 3,600 animal unit months of grazing total, on average. Let's say I'm going to set my cow herd at 75% of that. So I dedicate 2,700 animal unit months to my cow herd, and that leaves me 900 animal unit months of what I call flex animal unit months. Those are the ones I get to play with. So under that first scenario I told you, my approach would be every year I'm going to assume that I'm going to have 900 AUMs. And I'm going to, in this case, go buy stocker cattle to use up that 900 AUMs. But as the season rolls through, I may have to make adjustments because I may be overstocked as the season rolls along. Or the other approach would be stock my 2,700 AUMs of cows, check forage availability and forage conditions at the end of the growing season, then see how many flex animal unit months I have and go purchase those cattle or make arrangements to use that extra flex forage. Again, a couple of different approaches. What are different ways to do this? You probably are all familiar with these. I'm not going to come up with anything new for you, but just to plant some ideas. Dan mentioned retain ownership of your calf crop. What was his number? 7 out of 10 years it pays to retain ownership on your calves. What we're attempting to do here is add value. We're going to make them heavier. We may be taking advantage of that market appreciation that he showed you I'm weaning calves in the fall. If I can carry them to the spring, they may not have to gain weight. I may have just enough market appreciation to cover the cost of carrying those calves forward. But adding weight as well as market appreciation, there may be opportunities to participate in preconditioning, as Dan said. Wean the calves, use the excess forage, precondition, move them to somebody that may be wanting calves for wheat pasture later on in the fall. Or I think the one that a lot of folks out in my area are maybe looking at right now is developing heifer replacements or replacement heifers with no intentions of keeping them on the ranch permanently, but the intentions are to develop those heifers and sell them to somebody else. A little different approach to stocker production. Again, we've got flexible time period here. We can try taking them to the spring. We could take them out to midsummer, because at that time we can make a decision, what are the forage conditions that following summer? Do I need to go ahead and move those cattle away? The thing to remember on that's back to Dan's seasonal charts. When's the lowest prices for calves and feeder cattle? Out in the dead of summer, okay? Or you can carry them on out to the fall. This is going to be less challenging than purchased calves. Typically, with purchased calves, we'll talk about just that in a moment, you've got all kinds of issues you got to deal with. So cash flow may be important to think about, and then those marginal production costs, as Dan was talking about, what's the value of weight versus what it costs me to put that weight on. One thing to think about this, use a fancy Wall Street term, is you may want to arbitrage, okay? And I'll give you an example. Dan showed you an example on value of weight gain earlier, where you were, I think it was taking a 429-pound calf and putting another 50 or 70 pounds on it, and the value of weight gain was like 80 cents. Or you could have stepped down and bought that 329-pound calf and put 50 or something pounds on it, and the gain was worth $2. In some cases, if you want to use excess forage, as much as we like our own cattle that we produce, our own calves, you may be better off to arbitrage, which is sell my really good calves for a high dollar and go back and buy somebody else's problems. I don't know who it is that likes to wean 329-pound calves, but we still have them in the U.S., okay? And a lot of times, if you look at that value of weight gain on those really light calves, it's high. And the reason it's high, nobody wants to play with them most of the time. If you get out in the stocker business, most guys want to buy 400, 500-pound calves and work with them. A lot of people, or there's quite a few, don't care to bother with those really lightweight calves. And so part of this thinking of whether it's retain ownership or buy calves to use my excess forage, maybe I need to sell my good calves and go buy some other ones and make some money on the arbitrage, if you want to call it that, on the difference between those two. Okay, we could, like I said, we could sell our calves and go buy some more, make feeder cattle out of them. Again, what we're attempting to do here is add weight, or use the old term, we're going to upgrade the cattle some. It may be simply preconditioning. I'm going to get into the business and I'm going to buy some cattle, straighten them out, and sell them to somebody else that wants to go to wheat or some other program. We could go ahead and put market appreciation in here also. Take advantage of that low market in August and September, buy the calves, use our excess forage we may have accumulated, turn around, sell those calves in the spring on a higher market at a little bit heavier weight. As we all know, this is going to be a little bit more challenging than retained ownership of our own calves. We're going to have more morbidity and mortality issues than we would with our home-raised calves. So our front-end management costs are going to be a bit higher, and our labor requirements and some of our expertise may be different than what we're used to if we're strictly a cow-calf operator. But once again, these may be some of those opportunities Dan talked about to go buy some cattle that may be undervalued relative to what your home-raised calves are and take advantage of that undervalue. Because of the front-end cost, it may necessitate that you own these cattle for a bit longer period of time than you might your home-raised calves. Because if we think about morbidity and mortality issues in these purchased calves, if you run a 3 or 4% death loss on $800 calves, you've got somewhere between $25 and $32 a head on the survivors that you've got to cover because of death loss on the others. And then depending on what your morbidity issues are, you may have another $20 to $30 of medicine cost. So you may be sitting just on morbidity and mortality costs looking at 50 or 60 bucks a head front end cost that you may not have on your home raised calves. Well, it's going to take longer to recoup that 50 or 60 bucks than it would on your home raised calves, so your ownership period may have to change. We could purchase calves, not make feeder cattle out of them. Let's go to the idea of let's develop some heifers and sell bred heifers to somebody. I think Ron mentioned the USDA projections of low corn. I believe in that same report, or one that came out about the same time, USDA is projecting that over the next 10 years, the national cow inventory is going to increase about 16%. So there's going to be a market for replacement heifers. So in this case, our primary market, or what we're going to be adding value is we're going to make those cattle heavier, and then hopefully we're going to create a pregnancy that's worth some money to somebody. And there also may be some upgrade involved. Take a heifer that somebody may not really like, but make her look a lot better, upgrade her, and move her value up. So our primary market here is going to be selling a bred heifer. But the other thing to think about is we still have a really nice secondary market. It's called feeder heifers. If we have those that fail to become pregnant, we still have a very lucrative feeder heifer market we can move those through. You'll have the similar challenges as you would with the other stocker calves. You're going to have a challenge of achieving a pregnancy, which on most of these heifers is not a great challenge, and then finding that market for those pregnant heifers. And then length of ownership, that changes a bit compared to another stocker cattle operation, because remember, the value of that bred heifer increases the closer she is to term of having that calf. So if you really want to take advantage of it, you may have to own her for a longer period of time to take advantage of that pregnancy. Another one you might think about is reconditioning cows for resale. You'd be out here in the fall of the year typically looking at trying to buy some cows that somebody else didn't want necessarily, add weight, maybe upgrade condition. And if you're going to work in the cull cow market, trying to move those to the packer market, those are your two big issues. Increase weight, but also move those cows up in terms of their class that they'll bring at the packer market. We could take advantage of market appreciation. Again, Dan didn't show us a chart on cull cow prices, but cull cow prices are lowest when? About the same time the calf prices are bottoming out in the fall of the year. When do the cow prices go up for packer cows? About Christmas, after the first of the year, the prices go up. So again, we might be able to take advantage of some market appreciation across that time. And that could be with cows you purchase, or it could be you decide to keep your open cows that you might have been deciding to sell to use that excess forage and add value to those cows. Or you might want to try creating a pregnancy. Let's go buy some open cows for packer prices and to take the chance I can breed those cows and sell them back to somebody as a bred cow later. So again, the markets here would be packer cows or maybe replacement cows. It might be that you want to retain ownership of your own stock that you might normally cull and sell at that time of the year. Use that to use your excess forage up. We may be purchasing open or bred cows. Again, part of the risk in here is what are the knowns and unknowns. If I'm out buying cows on the open market, there's usually a reason she's out for sale somewhere. And so there's some knowns and unknowns there. And then again, length of ownership. If I'm simply trying to run that cow, increase weight, increase condition, I'm going to have a relatively short period of ownership. I want to take her in, put some weight and condition on her, and move her out. If I'm thinking I'm going to try breeding those cows so I can sell them back to somebody else as a bred cow, then my ownership period changes quite a bit. The other opportunity would be just to get into a lease operation. I've got excess forage. I'm going to sell it to somebody. And I'm going to shift the risk. I don't have to worry about owning the cattle. I don't have to expose myself to the risk. My only risk is finding a good client to lease to, okay? And things that need to come into play here as we think about this, because again, we're talking about temporary residents. We're not talking about long-term leases. What will be the duration of the lease period, and that may affect your customers. So as we start thinking about using leasing operations to use that quote excess forage, we've got to take into account what people might want to lease it for, or, as we'll show in just a minute, the value of that lease may be a lot lower than you think it ought to be because of the risk involved. But duration of the lease, expected performance of the cattle comes into play. What type of cattle? Again, leasing is going to work a lot better for yearling type cattle, whether it's developing heifers or stocker cattle. Leasing, short-term leases for cow-calf deals. Hopefully we're moving out of the drought and there's not going to be anybody looking for those, but short-term leases on cows are going to be harder to sell. Other things to take into account is expectations. What are your expectations as a landowner, and what are the expectations of the person you're trying to lease the grazing to? And then make sure you got an early termination contingency. Because again, these are my flex acres that I'm using to buffer against drought. So I need, as a landowner, I need to have the opportunity to make the call that you need to take all or part of those cattle away to help my management plan. Lease successes, again, a successful lease, you need to meet the demands of both parties. And those need to be communicated to one another, and we both need to appreciate what we both want. If we can't agree on it, then we don't have a lease. Identify and define the products and services contributed by each party. This is a key. Who's going to maintain the fence? Who's going to keep the water up? Who's going to do all this business? And how's that covered in the lease? Good follow-through by each party. And the landowner as well as the lessee should be able to adequately recoup the costs they need to cover. Risk reward and lease rates. Leases that are associated with a higher production risk aren't worth as much money. Unit-based, what I call unit-based leases. So this is leased by the head, leased by the acre. Remember, the lease rates on those are worth less than what I call production-based lease equivalents. So leasing by the gain on stocker cattle, you as a landowner, you're going to be able to achieve a higher return than you would on a per unit basis. And the reason that is, when you do it on a production-based lease, such as a gain-based lease, the landowner is taking part of the risk on. If the cattle don't gain weight very well, their lease payment goes down. If the cattle gain well, their lease payment goes up. If it's a unit-based lease, the landowner has no risk, or has very little risk. So that unit-based leases are worth less because it's a higher risk for the lessee. Production-based lease equivalents are higher because the landowners are partaking in part of the risk in that venture. And then finally, on the lease rates, what are the expectations for bearing the cost of maintenance, repairs, and other issues with the land and the facilities? Last one, if you've got introduced pasture, some native hay meadows, maybe you just forget about running cattle and you produce hay and sell it to somebody. Or maybe you use it yourself. The thing about that, you've got to learn, if you've never done it before, you've got to learn how to market hay. You've got to have some way to harvest and potentially store the hay. And the other thing to remember is if I have excess forage that I can cut for hay, everybody else in the country probably has excess forage they can cut for hay. And so the value of that hay is going to be lower. This year it may be a lot higher because all that stuff that we shipped in here for a couple of years from the Midwest and out west, we can ship it all back to California right now, okay? Because they're going to be needing it. So to close up on strategies to think about, because of the cost of re-entering the business right now and what I call potential climate risk out in front of us due to the climate cycles we're in, we need to develop strategies to protect our core investment, protect the land, and protect our production units, which are the cows, and avoid exposing ourselves to too much risk, reduce the financial and production risk of having to destock expensive cows or destock cows that you've held on to but are worth a lot of money right now with the potential for high returns later on. And figure out ways to market forage, whether it's retained ownership, purchase calves, purchase cows, hay production, lease it out, run stocker cattle, develop heifers, whatever, develop some strategies so we can take advantage of those times when we do have good rainfall and good forage production conditions. And I thank you for your time.